For this sample piece, we're going to be making a forged bracelet. The project's designed to give you practice with your hammer blows and to start controlling how you're distorting the metal each time you hit it with a hammer. This sample starts off as round wire. After dividing it up into 6 segments, we're going to then hammer in the middle of those segments, flaring out the middle, and then lightening up on our hammer blows as we work towards the lines that we divide up the segment with. With the bracelet I have here, you can see I've added a piece of tubing. That's in case you want to make a hinged bracelet. But I would recommend just starting with a bangle. An advanced variation of this bracelet would be this one here. I've divided this one up into 8 sections, and instead of hammering it flat, I'm going to still strike it in the middle, but I'm going to angle my hander, which is going to give me this ridge right down the middle. So it's basically creating a facet by the way you hit the metal with your hammer at an angle. Now this is a bracelet sizer, which is much like a ring sizer, where you can kind of use this to figure out the length of the bracelet. However, because we're going to be forging our bracelet, this won't be that useful. Okay, so for an average size bangle, we're going to start with a length of 8 3/4. We're going to be using some pretty hefty wire for this project. This is 4 gauge. So we're going to start off by measuring and cutting the material. Then we're going to file each end to make sure it's nice and flat. That way we can, when we join it, we'll have a good seam. You'll probably want to anneal the wire to make it a little bit more malleable, so when we form it, it's a little bit easier. Remember, we're going to be doing a lot of forging, so make sure you're working with dry metal so we're not rusting any of the tools. So we're going to extend the wire over the horn of the anvil and start making our bracelet form. And like when you're making a ring, you're not really going for a perfect circle. You're more looking for an oval in shape when you're joining the two, because you want, again, we've filed those ends at 90 degrees, so we want those to meet up pretty nicely. And you can kind of see how I'm just starting to bring this around. I'll get it pretty close, then I'll switch to either a bench or the anvil, the top of the anvil, and finish off closing the bracelet form. Again, trying to make this nice and perfect and lined up well. Okay, one trick, we're using some pretty beefy material, and we're going to be soldering this together. So one thing I'll do often before I even solder it is once I form it, I'll anneal it again, and that just relaxes the metal, and you won't have the metal wanting to pull apart when you heat it up again. So it basically takes the tension out of the metal. Alright, so we're going to realign that seam, flux, and solder that. And like when you're soldering a ring, when I first introduce the heat to the form, I'm going to aim it towards the opposite side of the seam. And again, that will it will cause the metal not to pull apart. Alright, so if you see, I'll point the fire towards the back end there. And that just, again, it helps the seam not pull apart when you heat it up. Now I'll just give it an overall heating. Alright, now this is a pretty big piece, so you're going to need a big flame for this. Alright, so now I usually will turn the torch down while I'm placing my solder, so I don't, again, eat through the flux. The longer you heat something, the more the flux will deteriorate. Now I'll crank it up again and get that flux, get that solder to flow. Sometimes I'll keep my pick nearby, and right when the solder is about to flow, I kind of push it where I want it to go, so it doesn't go either to the left or the right of the seam. It'll help it sort of find its way and let capillary action take place. Okay, next we'll start cleaning up our seam before we start hammering. So we'll do a little filing and sanding. And then we'll make this, we'll bring it back to round before we start forging it. And we can do that on the horn of an anvil, We could do it on the bullhorn stake. We could use a bracelet mandrel. Anything round will work. Okay, once we're round, I also want to make sure it's not warped, so you can kind of see I'm hammering it flat on the anvil. So we're again starting with a round, flat piece of metal. And here's an example where we could have rounded it off on a bracelet mandrel, and that would have worked great. And you could use it the same way I just used the horn of the anvil. Okay, now I want to divide up these segments, and I'm going to use this circle template, and it allows me to divide it up into a variety of different segments. For this project, I'm going to go with 6 different segments. So I'm marking it with my scribe, and then I'll probably go back and just make that line a little bit more apparent. I might even use a Sharpie so I can see it better. All right, and so what we're going to be doing is flaring out this center section. Okay, so we're going to start by hammering in the middle and then slowly working our way towards the lines we just drew. All right, and as we go towards that line, we're going to lighten up on the hammer blow. So if we hit it in the middle, the type of hammer we're going to be using is a forging hammer, and it's going to make it make the metal sort of expand in an omnidirectional fashion. So it'll just kind of form out that metal. And we could use a planishing hammer or a forging hammer. They both have a similar slightly curved face. The advantage of the forging hammer is its weight, and it'll move the material a little bit faster. Now remember to tuck that thumb in. Okay, so we're going to start hammering in the middle of the segments we just created, which is going to start to cause that to flare. And you can see it here, how it's starting to create this football shaped segment. And so if I'm doing a whole bracelet, I'll usually go a little at a time. I'm not going to fully flare each segment. It'll help keep it rounder if you start it a little at a time and just hammer it a little bit, then turn it, hammer it a little bit, and then turn it. And then after you go around your bracelet, which will work harden your bracelet really evenly, then you can start working out to the lines you created with that with the chart. Now we're going to start to work towards these lines. We're going to bring out the middle a little bit, and then we're going to hammer a little bit lighter as we work towards the line. So again, it keeps that football shape, and it will also create a little bit of a peak where that line is. So in effect, it'll be a little bit thicker in that location. And see how as I work towards the middle, I hammer a little bit heavier, and that will flare the middle a little bit more. Again, remember, the point of this exercise is to learn hammer control. So you're going to be watching every hammer blow, trying to make sure it's in the right location and in the right type of pressure. Okay. One thing that happens sometimes with this assignment is that people will think, oh, I'm just supposed to hammer it. But you're learning hammer control. You're not just learning how to hammer something all willy-nilly. And you can kind of see how I'm maintaining that sort of ellipse or football shape, bringing it out towards the middle, and then up, and basically creating a ridge. Right where that line is, see the little where I stop hammering, and then when I go towards the other side, it'll create a little bit of a ridge. And you see, and then you can work from one direction, and then from the other direction, kind of changing the angle of your hammer a little bit. Make sure you're watching what the hammer is doing. Notice if you hammer it a little to the left, you're going to see that material bulge out a little bit more to the left. If you hit it on the right, it's going to move more on the right. If you hammer it all on one side, you could actually bend the material because you're displacing that metal. So you want it to displace in an even fashion for this type of bracelet because we're going for a symmetrical look. Again, this is just to learn how to control the metal, not that you have to make everything symmetrical. But I think it's good practice to have that ability to know cause and effect of when you hit something in a certain place, what happens. Okay, so we're going to go and hammer through the whole piece. We're going to flare each segment and meet at that ridge point. And when you get done this, you're going to go back and you're going to start hammer through it one more time and just really concentrate on the hammer blows and making it look nice. All right, so make sure you're making those planish marks count. All right, I don't want you guys to do any filing or sanding on this after you're done, just because I want you to take advantage of those hammer blows and try and get them consistent. Sometimes you do have to round it out when you're done. And you can file and sand. Like this one here, I actually alternated between a polished surface and a hammered surface. All right. And I've even gone back and used a really sharp hammer. So I used this small riveting hammer, and I used the sharp edge of that to give it a little bit of a texture. All right, so I hammered that texture in. If you can, I think we'll get a closer look here, and you can kind of see that texture just to give it a nice consistent finish. This side texture is optional if you guys want to try it. Now this is the advanced one. I want you guys to do the first project, but if you want to try like every other segment to create this faceted one, I want to explain to you how I did this. So I want to create a ridge in the middle there, right? So the first step is to hammer it a little bit, just like we did, to start flaring out the material. So we're not going to angle the hammer right off the bat. We're going to basically do what we just did, is hammer out the middle a little bit and then work towards the ridges. We're not going to hammer it out quite as much as we did. We just want to start the process. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to angle the hammer, and you want to be careful not to catch the corner of your hammer on the horn of the anvil because you could dent it. All right, so you want to be really careful. All right, so I'm angling the hammer, and which is going to cause that metal to be at an angle, and the top of that angle is what's going to create your ridge. So I'm going to hammer it from one side, and then to turn the bracelet around and hammer it from the other, and I'll probably have to go back and forth 2 or 3 times to kind of start creating that ridge. All right, so I'll flip that around, and now I'm going to hammer again. See how I'm hammering at an angle and not straight down, and that's going to create a facet in that material. And by creating a facet on 2 sides, if you work towards the center, you'll create a ridge with where the 2 facets meet. And again, this takes a lot more hammer control. This is not, again, a requirement, but if you feel confident with what you've done so far and want to try, and you could either do another bracelet, or you could do every other facet. Okay, and I think you can kind of see what's happening, how I'm starting to create a ridge down the middle. Now this is a bracelet where I did that the central ridge down the whole thing. Now when you're done with your bracelets, you do want to make sure you clean up the inside. I don't want you to do sanding anything on the outside because I want to see your hammer blows to make sure you're getting the technique. But you do want things to look nice. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the inside of the bracelet with some sandpaper on a split mandrel.